Good afternoon. It has now been just over 4 months since the UK entered lockdown, and during that time we have been editing an unprecedented number of videos helping to clear the so-called post-A-level backlog. I can confirm we are now past the peak of the backlog, and the L number, that is to say the lag between the video being filmed and the video being uploaded, is now steadily coming down. I accept there have been some failures in regards to testing and PPE, that is to say testing the video to make sure it is watchable before being uploaded, and PPE provided to the viewer, including blindfolds and earplugs. Yes, of course, we have been counting each individual earplug individually. Now, my records show that it has been over 2 months since the last episode of the David Frankal show, which, according to my records, was episode 300,034,974,000. Now, some of you may be wondering if I will sack David Frankal for his uselessness, but the answer to that is no, because we don't do that sort of thing in this government. Generic name, generic media organisation.
Prime Minister, why are you talking about some kid's YouTube channel? I thought this was supposed to be a coronavirus press briefing.
Ah, the coronavirus. I had sort of forgotten that was happening. Yes, well, keep washing your hands, folks, and we'll get through this. Remember, stay at home, stay alert, get Britain bustling again, work from home if you possibly can, go to work, eat at restaurants, don't drive to Durham, but if you do, it's fine, and save lives. Now, if there's anything you wanted to add to that, Chris? Actually, I would just like to add... Thank you, Chris. Very helpful. I'll see you in the next press briefing in 2 to 3 months. Hello and welcome to the David Frankal show, and I just want to start by saying thank you all for 3,000 subscribers. It has been a long time since the last episode of the David Frankal show. I've been in London for most of lockdown. I spent about 2 months babysitting my 2 younger cousins who are 4 and 6 years old, which I think has been an enlightening experience. As you can see, I've been steadily working my way through the Interrail backlog, including Berlin Wall, What Happened to the Trains, which if you haven't watched yet, go and watch it now. I've talked a bit more about my own personal experience of lockdown over on my blog, which you can read in the description. In the meantime, let's talk politics. A lot has happened in the last 2 months, including the Dominic Cummings fiasco. For those of you who live under the world's biggest rock, the PM's closest advisor, Dominic Cummings, got into a bit of hot water a few months ago when it had emerged he'd broken lockdown rules to drive to a cottage in Durham while his wife had coronavirus symptoms. He would later develop symptoms himself. He tried to calm things down by giving a press conference, which was almost as ill-advised as Prince Andrew's interview with Emily Maitlis, in which he claimed he had driven to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight. Now, this happened a few months ago and everyone's sick of hearing about it, so I won't talk too much about it. I just want to add 2 things. 1, Neil Ferguson and Catherine Calderwood both resigned for similar, arguably less serious offences. And 2, it's remarkable just how much political capital the government sacrificed to defend Cummings, not just by not sacking him, but also by completely doubling down and defending what he did, arguably contradicting their own lockdown rules just for the sake of one advisor. The Cummings scandal has achieved a few things. It's certainly increased tension between the cabinet and the Tory backbenchers. It's narrowed the lead in the polls between the Tories and Labour, which was at an all-time high right at the beginning of the crisis. And it's demonstrated just how terrified the entire cabinet, including the Prime Minister, is of Dominic Cummings. Another issue that has caused tension between Boris and his backbenchers is Huawei. Now, the Huawei 5G scandal has been rumbling on for months now. It's been just over a year since Gavin Williamson was sacked from Theresa May's cabinet because of a leak regarding Huawei. In January, the government decided to allow Huawei to take part in the UK's 5G infrastructure, but under pressure from the United States and from Tory backbenchers, the government have now reversed that decision. And then just last week came the story of the Intelligence and Security Committee. Now, the government, presumably after having lost a drunk bet, decided to line up Chris Grayling to be the new chair. But at the last minute, Julian Lewis unexpectedly stepped forward for the role and with the help of opposition MPs was voted as leader. Number 10 were furious and lashed out by withdrawing the whip. That's fancy speak for kicking him out of the parliamentary party. The committee then went on to publish the so-called Russia report, which the government had been sitting on for the last, well, most of a year. It's just funny to me that backbench rebellions were such a common part of Theresa May's premiership, and since Boris Johnson won an 80-seat majority, we all thought that backbench rebellions would become a thing of the past. But it looks as though they will indeed stick around and continue to be a headache for the government. And now we look over to the United States. The murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police set off a wave of protests across the United States and indeed over in France and here in the UK. The statement Black Lives Matter should be pretty obvious and uncontroversial, and yet many Americans and Brits just don't seem to understand the point. The protests have sparked debates and arguments across the world concerning everything from police brutality to colonialist statues. On the 7th of June, protesters in Bristol pulled down a statue of the colonialist slave trader Edward Colston and threw him into the river. Attention has since turned to the various other statues across the UK of similar figures. My view is that it never should have come to this, but here we are. Councils and universities have been procrastinating from dealing with this issue for literally decades. Statues of historical figures responsible for genocide and murder have stood in our towns and cities for far too long. In the case of Colston, Bristol Council went as far as planning to put up a plaque to contextualise his actions and what he did, but it never happened because the Labour and the Tory councillors couldn't agree on how to word it. So is it really any wonder that people had enough and decided to throw him into the river? I think these statues would be best placed in museums where they can be contextualised with the information about what they actually did and who they were. The statues are important to our history, not so much because they tell us much about the historical figures themselves, but because they tell us about how these historical figures have been remembered. One idea I think we could borrow from Hungary is the idea of a statue park. When the Berlin Wall fell, most countries in the old Eastern Bloc blew up and destroyed all of their old communist statues, but not Hungary. Hungary decided to put them all in a park. So whilst communist icons no longer loom over Budapest, if you're interested in going to see them, you can take a bus off into the outskirts of the city and go and see the park, which is exactly what I did last February with my grandpa, and he could tell me where they all used to be. Anyway, back to COVID-19. The UK entered lockdown on the 23rd of March and emerged in stages. At first, the stay-at-home order was slightly eased on the 11th of May. Most shops reopened on the 15th of June and pubs and restaurants reopened on the 4th of July. On the 17th of July, the government lifted all restrictions on non-essential use of public transport, so I got to ride my first train since mid-March. This is my first journey by train since last March. Exciting. So this is my train, 12:40 Stoke-on-Trent. There's things you forget when you haven't travelled by train for so long. For example, I forgot to bring my rail card, so I had to pay extra. Stupid of me.
To remain vigilant. If you see anything suspicious, please report it to a member of staff or the British Transport Police via text on 61016. We'll sort it. See it, say it, keep it sorted. 2 metres away from other travellers. On the station, on board the train, and when queuing at ticket barriers. Thank you.
This pandemic is unlike anything I've ever experienced. The first few weeks I was in Hungary, then I came to the UK. It was marked with just uncertainty and chaos. Public panic buying led to shortages of toilet paper and hand sanitizer. The first few weeks of the lockdown weren't so bad. I mean, it was a bit of a novelty, but there was also just a kind of solidarity across the UK and indeed across much of Europe, including the weekly clapping for the NHS. I was with my cousins who hadn't exactly been planning for me to move in, but you know what, they looked after me and we looked out for each other and helped each other through. So wherever you are in the world, how has your experience of the pandemic been?
I'm Zsófi from Pécs, Hungary, and I'm working as a school psychologist, so I'm in home office since the schools are closed in Hungary since the 13th of March. We don't have as many cases in Eastern and Central Europe as in the rest of the world, but the panic was the same in the spring. Shelves were empty in the stores, for example. and I felt the anxiety in the air. And as a psychologist, I felt the responsibility for the mental health of the community, so I wrote articles about it in a weekly basis. And of course, I worked online with my clients. Now there are officially no cases in my town, so we have a little break to enjoy the summer.
Hi, I'm Camilla. I've travelled to Wales from Germany. I made the journey by train. The IC was okay, but there isn't particularly good passenger distancing. But the Eurostar, fantastic. Everybody wore face masks and the distancing was really well organised by Eurostar. Only one passenger per row, at least 1.5 metres between each passenger. When I got back to Wales, I kind of isolated and kept a lot of distance from my mother, who I'm staying with. She's a super vulnerable person, and we use the kitchen at different times, and I was always wiping things down. We formed a bubble with my brother and sister-in-law and their 2 children, and now with my second brother and sister-in-law and their 2 children. So we're all playing happy families. In Wales, things are well organised in the supermarkets. We go super early, so there's hardly anyone around, around 7:30, 8 in the morning. We've got into wild water swimming because in Wales none of the swimming pools have opened up, even the outdoor ones. So we've taken to the rivers and we travel particularly to the River Wye. We're going for a 3rd time on Friday, and we're going to combine it with kayaking and canoeing, and then we stop off at little islands and have a picnic, and it's just heaven. And back in Germany, life is completely so different because there we opened up so much earlier and all the COVID measures are in place. So new normal has been going on for a good couple of months. I was even back teaching swimming on the weekends. Unfortunately not in the pool with the kids, but teaching from the side.
A man went into lockdown quite early, ahead of the UK, and actually we went into lockdown 2 days before the country went into lockdown because I'd been in the office, and the next morning when I was travelling to a meeting, I saw in our WhatsApp group that someone had got it, who was maybe the 3rd person in the country to get it, I think, who was works for Oman Air basically, and he'd been in our offices the day before. So I decided not to go back to my meeting, but to go straight back home. Anyway, 2 days later it was a total lockdown. And it was a total lockdown, much more than in the UK. And at least at the beginning it seemed to be working. They did keep the supermarkets open, but it was masks, temperature, which they didn't do in the UK at the time. And you weren't supposed to be out at all, you weren't even supposed to go for a walk at all, you're supposed to be in your home all the time. Masks were compulsory everywhere at all times. Most people do wear a mask out, I would say. It was quite strict for at least a couple of months. And then we had Eid, which is like Christmas, for a week. And after that it all seemed to fall apart a little bit. The numbers started going up, which was also the time they started opening up a little bit. But the country was very quiet, because it was also the first bit was Ramadan, which is anyway very quiet. So it was very, very quiet. And then it was summer, and summer is quite quiet and extremely hot, so you don't get many people congregating outside anyway.
Because it's hot.
Because it's hot, and you don't do it anyway. Airports closed, shops were closed, mosques were closed. Now they've reopened a little bit.
There's no
shops
public
and whatnot.
transport
There's no public
anyway.
transport. There's buses. The buses are going to start again next month, on the 1st of August actually, yeah. But you're only allowed, I think, 10 people on a bus or something like that. So the airport was closed throughout, still is till today, which means officially no flights in, no flights out, nothing. Borders are closed. Only Omanis are allowed in and no one else, and only expats are allowed out and no one else. But during the time there have been these so-called special repatriation flights, so you can get a one-way ticket back to, Pakistan or Frankfurt or London. So on the 1st of July, you did take such a flight, didn't you? To be with your one and only eldest son.
My favourite eldest son. Yeah, how was my flight? I mean, it was business class, which was probably 100 times better than flying on economy. But still, I was very, very anxious. had some alcohol on it, and I went to sleep. Yeah. Couldn't even eat my lovely food. After the amused girl, I wasn't anymore amused.
And a month later, me and David's brother now followed. And it was also fine. Airport was very quiet. Most things were closed.
Actually, 3 weeks later.
3 weeks later. And the plane was fine. And arriving in London, honestly, it was like totally normally arriving in London. We walked through passport in the automatic passport control. A little bit less busy than usual.
Oh,
Picked
I
up
don't
the
know,
bags,
on the
left
first,
the airport.
it was empty. It was like a goods town.
No, ours wasn't empty. It wasn't empty at all. It wasn't that busy, but it wasn't empty.
Totally empty on the
And were your forms checked, your self-isolation forms?
No, but they're electronic. But neither of us had our forms checked or seen. Didn't need to hand them in. But we have had a phone call since we've been here, so somebody is checking up.
Finally, I want to get serious and break down just how well the UK government has responded to this crisis. Now, despite my political leanings and my well-documented views on the current leadership, my initial instinct in this crisis was to trust that the government and its scientific advisors knew what they were doing. But with the benefits of hindsight and the appalling figures to hand, was I right? After all, we were behind countries like Italy and Spain, yet we ended up with a worse death toll than both of them. In fact, the highest death toll in Europe. How and why did that happen, and where did the government go wrong? In the early days of the crisis, when the pandemic was limited mainly to China, the government had a pretty robust containment strategy, quarantining arrivals from Wuhan and holidaymakers from the Diamond Princess cruise ship. But once the virus spread to northern Italy, this became more difficult to maintain, and a strategy of self-isolation was pursued instead. On the 4th of March, the Prime Minister gave his first major coronavirus press briefing alongside scientific experts Sir Patrick Vallance and Professor Chris Whitty. For 45 minutes, the Prime Minister spoke and answered questions and sounded optimistic, but also sounded like he was way out of his depth, whilst the two scientists on either side sounded like they had more of a grip on the situation, but didn't really know how to reassure the public. The government released its 4-part strategy: contain, delay, research and mitigate. But little action was taken the following week, with mass gatherings including the Cheltenham races going ahead. On the same day, the 13th of March, the Premier League suspended itself. It was not told to suspend by the government. The UK government stepped up its response on the 16th of March, advising against unnecessary travel and social contact, advising people to avoid pubs and restaurants, though not closing them, and advising those who can to work from home.
Now is the time for everyone to stop non-essential contact with others and to stop all unnecessary travel. We need people to start working from home where they possibly can, and you should avoid pubs, clubs, theatres and other such social venues.
A week later, on the 23rd of March, the UK declared a full lockdown.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
So that raises two questions. One, why wasn't a full lockdown announced on the 16th of March? And two, why was a full lockdown then announced on the 23rd of March? Now, a disclaimer, everything I'm about to say is my own view. Part of it is speculative. Different people will draw different conclusions. I think the answer to the first question is that the government desperately wanted to avoid a lockdown, knowing the economic and social damage it would cause. The government were also initially quite sceptical of lockdown measures. One government minister referred to Italian-style lockdown measures as populist and unscientific. As explained in the earlier press briefings, the plan was clearly to delay and push down the peak of the virus. And it was hoped that these softer measures would achieve that and allow the country to avoid a lockdown altogether. The government also declined to close schools at first, though this decision was reversed a few days later. Why then did the government seemingly U-turn and declare a full lockdown a week later? I propose 3 reasons. 1, the government badly underestimated just how quickly the virus was spreading in the UK. Clearly the scientists were taken aback by how quickly it had spread in Italy, but the government foolishly tried to cover its tracks by consistently saying we were 3 or 4 weeks behind Italy, even though the figures clearly showed the real answer was 2. 2, the government overestimated how receptive the public would be to vague and advisory measures. The announcement on the 16th of June, combined with nice weather, created a perfect storm where hundreds and thousands of Brits descended on coastal towns and national parks on the weekend of the 21st and 22nd of March. Snowdonia National Park in Wales reported a record high number of visitors. And number 3, international pressure. French President Emmanuel Macron allegedly threatened to close the border with the UK if the UK didn't introduce a stricter lockdown. Many people believe the government initially followed a strategy of herd immunity. In fact, on the 5th of March, the Prime Minister said this.
And one of the theories is that, perhaps you could sort of take it on the chin, take it all in one go and allow the disease, as it were, to move through the population. Without really taking as many draconian measures, I think we need to strike a balance.
Yeah, that sounds pretty bad, albeit it's not the only stupid thing the Prime Minister said early on in the pandemic.
I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
So was the UK strategy to infect the entire population with coronavirus, or could it be possible that the Prime Minister is an idiot who doesn't know what he's talking about, and the best thing he could have done that week was to stay as far away from cameras as possible? Some sources reported that the UK government changed its strategy because they saw the results of new modelling that suggested a herd immunity strategy would result in 500,000 deaths. But here's why I don't buy that theory. You don't need an advanced maths degree or complex computer modelling to figure out that a virus with a mortality rate of 1% infecting 80% of a population of 65 million would result in about 500,000 deaths. That's just basic maths. So there's no way that was actually the government's strategy. During a press briefing on the 12th of March, Sir Patrick Vallance said this.
And it's important to recognise it's not to stop everybody getting it. You can't do that. It's not possible to stop everybody getting it. And it's also actually not desirable because you want some immunity in the population. We need to have immunity to protect ourselves from this in the future.
To me, that sounds like a justification for not following a strategy of eradication as New Zealand did. It doesn't sound to me like he was ever planning for 80% of the UK population to get infected. Especially as this would result in the NHS being overwhelmed, something the government consistently said they wanted to avoid. So moving on from the timing of the lockdown, how did the government handle the epidemic itself? Well, to give credit where credit is due, there have been some high-profile successes, perhaps most visibly the construction of the Nightingale hospitals in just a matter of days. These were converted indoor spaces like the Excel in London, or the Manchester Convention Centre, formerly Manchester Central Railway Station. Less visible, but perhaps even more important, was what was essentially the annexation of a large part of the private healthcare sector. All of this helping to increase the NHS's intensive care capacity. The furlough scheme, though it didn't cover everyone, was an unprecedented measure to try and limit job losses and ensure that people could sustain themselves throughout the lockdown. But alongside these successes, there have also been catastrophic failures reflecting on the government, but also more widely the civil service, and really the country as a whole in terms of our ability to plan and our logistical infrastructure. Testing capacity and PPE distribution has been a complete and utter disaster. Community testing and tracing was largely stopped on the 12th of March due to a lack of capacity, and wasn't restored until mid-May. Efforts to create a contact tracing app, something South Korea has managed just fine for months, have fallen flat on their face. Now, the decision to stop community testing on the 12th of March was understandable there and then, but the fact that we were in that situation showed that the UK clearly failed to make use of the early months of the pandemic to build up our testing capacity, and it took far too long to build up the testing capacity again after March. The lack of testing had a detrimental effect on the UK's ability to keep track of the pandemic, especially where it was spreading geographically. And worst of all, the ability to protect frontline NHS and care home workers. The story of PPE was a similar one. The country didn't have enough stockpiles in advance, nor was it able to distribute PPE effectively to hospitals and care homes, and no doubt there were many preventable deaths as a result. But perhaps the worst failure of all was care homes. To reduce pressure on the NHS, the government instructed hospitals to discharge care home patients back into care homes, but incredibly until the 15th of April it wasn't required that they be tested first. For a whole month, thousands of care home residents were being discharged from hospitals back into care homes without being tested. We now know that there have been nearly 20,000 COVID-19 deaths in our care homes. It is a fact that that decision not to test care home residents directly and undoubtedly resulted in thousands of preventable care home deaths. In the early weeks of the pandemic, the government were uncharacteristically frank and open about the situation, but it didn't take long for dishonesty to creep back in. For one, the government have been consistently in denial about the failures in regards to both testing and PPE. The government have even gone as far as to inflate the figures, such as by counting every individual glove as an item of PPE, or counting the number of tests rather than the number of people tested. The government frequently accuses opposition parties of trying to politicise the crisis every time they raise concerns, yet they themselves have taken advantage of the crisis to score political points, such as by attacking teachers' unions over concerns over schools reopening.
I think what we would like to hear from the right honourable gentleman is a bit of support for that, and a bit of encouragement to pupils, and perhaps even encouragement to some of his friends in the left-wing trades unions to help get our schools ready.
And perhaps the biggest whopper of all, after all we know about what happened to care homes, was Matt Hancock having the brass neck to claim that the government threw a protective ring around care homes from the start.
So right from the start, we've tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes.
So what about the scientific advice? Well, obviously I didn't dare question it at the time, because what do I know? But armed with hindsight, it's clear that a lot of important advice wasn't issued soon enough. It took until the 12th of March for the government to advise people experiencing coronavirus symptoms to stay at home, even though the virus had already been circulating in the UK for weeks. It took until the 16th of March for the government to extend that advice to entire households. Meanwhile, quarantine for international arrivals was introduced on the 8th of June. But the worst inconsistency of all regards these face masks. In March, the government explicitly told us not to wear them because they don't prevent you from catching the virus, and they might give you a false sense of security in terms of social distancing. But by April, it was widely known that masks did help prevent you from spreading the virus unknowingly. At this point, usage became widely encouraged in the United States and various other countries, but here in the UK it took until the 15th of June for face masks to become mandatory on public transport, and the 24th of July for them to be mandatory in shops. How on earth did that happen? Has the science changed? I didn't use a face mask in shops back in March and April because nobody told me to, and also because you couldn't buy them in most supermarkets and pharmacies. Clearly, in hindsight, we should have been wearing them from the start. So to conclude, why did the UK end up with 45,000 confirmed deaths, the highest death toll in Europe? Was it a deliberate, cynical government strategy to kill off its own citizens? No. Was it completely inevitable and unpreventable? No. Was it a combination of slowness to react, hesitation to take serious action, government incompetence, and frankly bad scientific advice? Probably. I think it's those things that have led us to the appalling situation we find ourselves in now, and I think it would be wise not to repeat the same mistakes if a second wave hits us in the winter. This was a rather serious episode. Normal service will resume next week /month /year. Tune in for a new episode of Train News next Sunday. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe.
With contact tracing.